Now we would like to start invited lecture. Dr. Sakamoto will chair the session. Dr. Sakamoto, please start.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is the most important session of all this Congress. This time, we have invited a select group of world-class experts, and one of them is Professor Jerry Sebag. In the modern sense, the field of research on vitreous and retina was pioneered by Jerry. When I began my research on the vitreous in late 90s, his work was already featured in many books, chapters, and without question, he was a leading figure in vitreoretinal research worldwide. His contributions are so well known that there is hardly anything that I need to add. You are aware already of his achievement. Beyond this basic research, Jerry has also made significant contribution to the development of various surgical techniques. His dedication and influence make him nothing short of a superstar in this field. Jerry is not only an outstanding researcher, but also an exceptional human being. When we faced difficulties at any time, he always went out his way to support us. Such individuals are rare, and his warm smile has always encouraged me. It is a great honor for Fuji Retina to welcome Jerry and have him deliver a lecture at this conference. Jerry.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and I'm grateful to Professor Sakamoto, Professor Kadanosono, and the entire organizing committee for the honor of inviting me to give this lecture, which is entitled Vitreous and Vision-Degrading Myodysopsia from Vitreous Floaters. Vision-degrading myodysopsia is the term that we use to refer to clinically significant cases of vitreous floaters. Posterior vitreous detachment is the leading cause for vitreous floaters, and it's the consequence of two concurrent processes. Fibrous liquefaction of the vitreous occurs when hyaluronan is dissociated from collagen, allowing the collagen molecules to cross-link and form ever larger structures within the vitreous body. And the panel on the left shows the progression from childhood to adulthood and to old age, where increasing cross-linking of the collagen results in opacities within the vitreous body that interfere with light getting to the retina and create the floaters that many of our patients complain about. There's also dehiscence at the vitreoretinal interface. And when you have destabilization of the vitreous body as a result of the biochemical changes with weakening of vitreoretinal adhesion, you get separation from the retina. And the dense matrix of collagen fibrils shown in the upper right hand is responsible for a lot of the light scattering that creates the phenomenon of floaters. But the separation of the posterior vitreous away from the retina forces it into a surface area that's smaller than when it was attached to the retina. That creates folds, and those folds induce multiple scattering, worsening the phenomenon of floaters. Myopic vitreopathy is the second leading cause for vitreous floaters, and the process that I just described occurs in myopic patients, but it occurs much earlier in life, and this is a very common problem that is going to be even bigger in Asia with the epidemic of myopia that is predicted to afflict 5 billion people by the year of 2050. The critical question is whether floaters are simply a nuisance or whether they're a disease. If you ask the patients, it's clearly a disease. Studies have shown that the negative impact of vitreous floaters is believed by patients to be equivalent to AMD and worse than glaucoma and diabetic retinopathy. Remarkably, patients would be willing to accept a 7% risk of blindness to get rid of their floaters. They would be willing to exchange 1 year for every decade of remaining life simply to be rid of their floaters. But doctors don't consider floaters a disease. They consider it just a nuisance. Why is that? I think it's because of the absence of objective clinical indices of vitreous structure and visual function with which to define vitreous floaters as a disease. And this has hampered acceptance of vitreous floaters as clinically significant. So we've dedicated the past dozen years or so to develop such clinical indices that would help us evaluate patients, make the diagnosis of vision-degrading myodysopsia, and determine the level of severity. The first of these indices was the measure of visual function by measuring contrast sensitivity, because all of these patients have good visual acuity. Yet contrast sensitivity, as you'll shortly see, is significantly impaired in patients complaining of vitreous floaters. The second is to evaluate vitreous structure using quantitative ultrasonography. And this will give us a number, not just a qualitative evaluation of vitreous structure, but a number that we can use to grade the level of severity of vision-degrading myodysopsia. The third clinical index is the development of a vitreous floaters functional questionnaire. It's designed very much like the National Eye Institute VFQ-25, but the questions are more specifically related to vitreous floaters. Beginning with contrast sensitivity, we did a prospective study that was published in 2016 showing that in a group of patients who had no PVD at initial study entry, then developed a PVD, there was a 52.5% degradation of contrast sensitivity. Another study showed that after the vitreous detaches, continued changes within the vitreous body cause increasing vitreous echo density in older age. Contrast sensitivity is also very useful to discern between different types of patients with floaters. 95% degradation in patients who chose vitrectomy, there were 326 such patients, as compared to asymptomatic controls. There was a 44% degradation in contrast sensitivity in the group that chose to undergo vitrectomy, as compared to the group of patients with floaters who chose observation. This graph shows the relationship between vitreous echo density on the x-axis and contrast sensitivity on the y-axis. The higher the number on the y-axis, the worse the contrast sensitivity. And what you can see is that with increasing vitreous echo density, there is worsening degradation in contrast sensitivity. This graph also shows the difference between patients who chose vitrectomy in blue dots and patients who chose observation. And you can see that both vitreous echo density and contrast sensitivity are worse in the patients who chose vitrectomy as compared to the patients who chose observation. That's true for myopic vitreopathy as well. The graph in the center panel shows that with increasing axial length, there is increasing vitreous echo density. The most unhappy patients are those who have both myopic vitreopathy within the vitreous body, as well as a posterior vitreous detachment. Developing the vitreous floaters functional questionnaire was a very entertaining process. I have to tell you, it's not just throwing a bunch of questions together. There's a very rigorous process with which to perform principal component analysis and develop questions that are legitimate in evaluating patients. And what we found after developing this questionnaire was there was a high correlation with vitreous echo density, as shown in the upper left-hand graph, so that with increasing vitreous echo density, there is decreasing VFFQ scores. It goes from 0 to 100, just like the VFQ-25. In the upper right-hand panel, you can see contrast sensitivity. With worse contrast sensitivity, there is worse VFFQ scores. It also can discriminate between patients who choose vitrectomy as compared to patients who choose observation. Higher VFFQ scores were associated with patients who had floaters but weren't bothered enough to elect vitrectomy, but lower scores were noted in patients who chose to undergo vitrectomy. Armed with these three clinical metrics, we're able to offer treatments. And I can't get into the various treatments that are available, but I'll focus just on vitrectomy. Originally, I called it limited vitrectomy. I now call it limited refractive vitrectomy because, in essence, this is refractive surgery. We're improving contrast sensitivity. That's the objective of surgery. And we were faced with a decision as to whether to design an operation that was going to be effective in the hopes that it would be safe, but we chose to design an operation that would be safe in the hopes that it would be effective. So we performed sutureless 25-gauge vitrectomy, and we do not induce a surgical PVD so as to mitigate against retinal breaks and retinal detachments, but also mitigate against cataract formation. We also preserve 3 to 4 millimeters of gel vitreous behind the lens so that it can inhibit the reactive oxygen species that cause cataract formation. Today I'll be presenting the results in 326 cases. On the left, you can see the preoperative etiologies for their vitreous floaters, and we have very long follow-up, more than 6 or 7 years in over 50 patients. This graph shows, again, the comparison of controls who have no floaters to patients who have floaters but chose observation, and patients with floaters who chose limited refractive vitrectomy. In 326 cases that underwent this procedure, there was normalization of contrast sensitivity. Again, the higher the number on the y-axis, the worse the contrast sensitivity. And what you can see is within 3 months, it's actually within 1 week, there was normalization of contrast sensitivity in a very large number of patients that was sustained for weeks and months thereafter. It was also true of patients with different lens types. We were concerned that maybe patients with multifocal IOLs would not respond to limited refractive vitrectomy, but that wasn't the case. They didn't respond as well as monofocal, shown in the center, or phakic individuals, shown on the right, but there was still a 37% improvement in contrast sensitivity in patients with multifocal IOLs. So consider evaluating the vitreous in your patients who have multifocal IOLs and are not happy. If indeed there is increased density of their vitreous, you might consider vitrectomy as a way of making them somewhat happier. This graph shows the visual quality of life using the VFFQ-27 questionnaire, and we compared that questionnaire to the VFQ-25. And what we found was that there was 49% improvement after limited refractive vitrectomy by the VFFQ-27, but only 8% improvement in the NEI VFQ-25. And that's because the questions are very general and they're not specific enough for vitreous floaters. The sequelae following vitrectomy are shown here. They're separated by acute and chronic. 2.5% incidence of retinal tears. Some of those were noted intraoperatively and some occurred postoperatively. Only 2% experienced retinal detachments, and these are very acceptable levels of untoward sequelae. Chronic sequelae, only 2 cases of glaucoma resulted in these 326 cases. 4 cases required macular pucker surgery, and 36% required cataract surgery with a 5-year follow-up. We'll also discuss the recurrent floaters phenomenon that occurred in 4.6% of cases. 35.8% of phakic patients required cataract surgery, an average of 2 years after their limited refractive vitrectomy. It ranged from 3 months to 102 months after the vitrectomy. These patients were typically older. Their average age was 62.7, as compared to the patients who did not require vitrectomy, who they were 54.6 years of age. Interestingly, in the individuals less than 50 years old, only 8% required cataract surgery. 50 to 60 years of age, 40% required cataract surgery, and over the age of 60, only 45% required cataract surgery. This is much better than what the literature describes as the incidence of cataract surgery following vitrectomy for floaters, and I believe it's because of the design of not inducing surgical PVD and leaving gel vitreous behind the lens. This results in a 50% increase in retrolental oxygen levels as compared to a 300% increase in patients who undergo extensive vitrectomy. Recurrent floaters occurred in 14.9%. These are people who had no PVD pre-op and did not have surgical PVD induction. They were typically young, myopic, phakic males with a partial PVD. 13 out of these 15 chose repeat vitrectomy and had restoration of good contrast sensitivity. Pre-op, their contrast sensitivity was 4% Weber. Again, the higher the number, the worse the contrast sensitivity. Following vitrectomy, they reduced to the normal range of 2% Weber. Then they had a new onset PVD in these 15 individuals, and the contrast sensitivity degraded once again. Repeat vitrectomy in 13 individuals normalized their contrast sensitivity. The other case is the case of asteroid hyalosis, where in an individual who does not have a PVD, not removing the outer layer of vitreous leaves asteroid bodies close to the retina and does not improve the contrast sensitivity as much as we experienced with the other patients. So in conclusion, vitreous opacities degrade contrast sensitivity. We've developed the measure of contrast sensitivity as well as quantitative ultrasonography and a questionnaire specific for floaters to provide clinical metrics of vision-degrading myodysopsia. Limited refractive vitrectomy without surgical PVD induction is effective, and we now consider inducing surgical PVD in patients who are young myopic phakic males with a partial PVD or those who have asteroid hyalosis and no PVD. This procedure is clearly safe, at least it's safe enough if we're going to fulfill the goal of modern medicine, which should be to help people die young, as late in life as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Wonderful talk. This issue is very important, but quite new for Asian doctors. Please keep teaching us as you used to do. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Jerry, come into the center of. I don't have to read, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sabag and Dr. Sakamoto.